Hello, I'm Jina Kim, your host for the GEOVISTA. As we welcome the new year in 2025, the GEOVISTA continues to explore major issues around the world. Today is our third episode in our series. Polarization is deepening worldwide, leading to ongoing conflicts, both big and small. South Korea is no exception. In particular, political and ideological tensions have intensified following the December 3rd martial law incident. Today, we take an in-depth look at the growing polarization in our society. This is the GEOVISTA.
저희는 여러분을 해치려는 게 아닙니다. 여러분들에게 기회를 드리는
이런 게임을 보시는 일이 딱히 이 세상을 바라보는 것과 이렇게 동떨어지지 않은 일이 될 것이라고 생각을 하고요.
Describing the protest outside the Hannam-dong residence as a real-life Squid Game vividly illustrates the intensity of Korea's raw political reality. On December 3rd, President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law sent shockwaves across the nation. This event has exposed the deep political polarization in South Korea. The divide is especially evident in the protests unfolding outside the presidential residence.
사실 지금 나라가 위기에 빠졌잖아요. 그러니까 그런 것 때문에 저도 한몫하고 싶어서 몸으로는 여기 못 오더라도 영상으로나 뭐랄까 응원은 계속 하고 싶습니다.
다 같이 모여 있으니까 더 따뜻하게 할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 사람들이 많이 모일수록 그 힘이 더 강하다고 생각해요. 반드시 저희끼리 모여서 꼭 이뤄냈으면 좋겠습니다.
Then, on January 19th, President Yoon became the first sitting president in South Korea's constitutional history to be arrested, escalating division and clashes even further. In particular, some supporters protesting the arrest warrant stormed the court and caused chaos, an incident widely criticized for going beyond free expression and undermining the fundamental order of democracy. The ideological divide between progressives and conservatives is becoming increasingly intense due to political polarization. In South Korea, ideological polarization has been a growing issue for years. According to a German research institute, South Korea's ideological polarization index, which stood at 0.36 during the 19th general election in 2012, rose to 1.26 at the 21st general election in 2020. Over the past decade, not only have political parties diverged, but voters' ideological leanings have also shifted significantly to the far left or right. The recent martial law incident has further exacerbated these divisions, intensifying political tensions across the nation. Of course, polarization is not a new phenomenon in South Korea. Regional divisions, deeply intertwined with political and ideological polarization, offer a clear example. Political tendencies became deeply rooted as early as the 1960s and 1970s, with the Yeongnam region consistently supporting conservative parties and the Honam region favoring progressive parties. More recently, the divide between the Seoul metropolitan area and non-metropolitan regions has also been growing. Where does this division stem from? South Korea's political polarization dates back to the ideological divide following the country's liberation and during the Cold War era. The Lee Seung-man administration entrenched anti-communist ideology while suppressing progressive forces. Later, the Park Chung-hee regime's authoritarian rule laid a foundation for the enduring Yeongnam-Honam divide. With democratization in 1987 and the introduction of direct presidential elections, the era of authoritarian rule formally ended. However, partisan conflicts only deepened. South Korea's political system, which closely resembles a two-party structure, has further fueled hostility between rival parties, leading voters to align more strongly along partisan lines. In 2008, large-scale candlelight protests against U.S. beef imports starkly illustrated how ideological conflicts could escalate into political confrontations. Similarly, during the Park Geun-hye administration, a corruption scandal intensified polarization by merging political and ideological divides with regional loyalties. The narrow margin between the two leading candidates in the most recent presidential election also underscored the extent of South Korea's deepening political polarization. More recently, advancements in media technology and the widespread use of social media have further exacerbated this divide. Online platforms, in particular, create echo chambers where individuals are exposed only to content that reinforces their political views, worsening generational and gender-based conflicts. The bigger concern is that this polarization is having far-reaching consequences across the South Korean society. It undermines social cohesion, slows national progress, and exacerbates economic difficulties by weakening consumer confidence and shrinking the domestic market. If political instability continues, South Korea could face additional risks, including the potential for a downgrade in its national credit rating. At this critical juncture, South Korea must seize the opportunity to turn this crisis into a catalyst for advancing as a more mature and resilient democracy. But is polarization solely a South Korean problem? Political, ideological, religious, economic, and racial divisions are deepening worldwide. Even the United States, often hailed as the world's largest and most robust democracy, is grappling with similar challenges of division.
The so-called of Texas and California.
Extreme ideological clashes, power struggles, and social fragmentation, the movie Civil War eerily mirrors the reality we face today. In 2021, the storming of the U.S. Capitol exemplified how political polarization can escalate to the point of undermining and threatening the democratic electoral process. In Europe, far-right and far-left parties continue to coexist, heightening political divisions. Meanwhile, in Latin America, economic inequality and social instability have fueled intensifying confrontations between right and left-wing parties. With polarization worsening across the globe, 2025 has to be the year for seeking true unity and reconciliation. We've explored the historical roots of South Korea's political and ideological divisions, as well as the broader trend of polarization worldwide. Now we turn to the question, how has political conflict extended into gender divides? To delve into this issue, we are joined by Professor Kim Jo-eun from the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, who specializes in sociology and gender studies. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
South Korea is experiencing political turmoil. It is the first time in our constitutional history a sitting president has been arrested on charges of insurrection. But the reactions from political parties seem to be quite divided. Do you think the political and ideological division and polarization in South Korea has become more severe than before?
At a first glance, it looks like South Korea is having one of the deepest political polarization ever in history. But the answer is yes and no. So it is polarizing in terms of affective dimension, but it is not polarizing in terms of ideological dimension. So when we look at some statistics, there's still a large proportion of Korean public who is holding moderate views on multiple policy matters, such as whether we should expand on healthcare service or unemployment benefits, or whether workplace have to provide more support for work-family conflict. When it comes to all these policy substantive matters, people are not divided. So ideologically, people are not divided. But we call it, nowadays, South Korea is experiencing the rise of affective polarization. So affective polarization is not really about substantive differences, but it's about just dislike and hatred against the other group. So a lot of the Korean public are now expressing strong hostility towards people from different political groups. And then this is quite concerning because people start hating each other even if they share similar views on multiple political issues. So the key example is that if you ask people around, nowadays a lot of people hate certain political figures and identities just because of their character, not necessarily because of their political agenda. So this kind of affective polarization is concerning more than ideological polarization because it's difficult to manage more than political disagreement.
Right. Let's talk about the recent events. Following President Yoon's arrest, some of his supporters ran out to the street and stormed the Seoul District Court, causing some disturbance before being dispersed by the police this time, right? What are the underlying causes of this violent, very extreme protest that we see today?
It is a clear evidence. What happened at the courthouse in recent days is the evidence that the political polarization is about emotional one rather than ideologically driven one. What we saw at the courthouse isn't about people trying to protest, trying to impose their ideological positions. It's more like emotional expression and then committed loyalty to certain political candidates. And another potential factor that amplify this violence or support this violence is the role of social media. Nowadays, social media creates echo chamber effects. It's an effect where environments and spaces where extreme views are reinforcing existing beliefs and bias. So a lot of people believe that this kind of extreme violence and behaviors, which was once unacceptable before, are seen as normalized because, in fact, the people who produce extreme violence and views online is probably less than 3% of the population. However, these views are considered to be representative of the entire general population. So these people consume these extreme views and then they feel like this kind of violence are acceptable. So it's a combination of social media echo chamber as well as this affective polarization that is encouraging some of these people to engage in irrational behaviors, such as storming a courthouse.
But still, political and ideological division or polarization seems to be evident in the case of recent political events, such as during the recent presidential election, we could see gender divide between men and women, especially among the young generation, supporting progressive or conservative ideas. And also during the recent protest related to impeachment, we could see young female generation came out to the street supporting very actively in this protest events. So how do you see the connection between political polarization and the gender issue here?
This kind of gender divide has been observed not just in Korea and elsewhere. So the connection between the gender divide and then political polarization is connected, but I don't think that gender conflict is the only reason that is creating this political polarization. It's just one of the evidence that people are becoming more and more emotionally divided. When it comes to this gender divide among the younger generation, there are many reasons that is creating this stark gender conflict. One is that South Korea have experienced one of the fastest compressed gender revolution. Unlike other countries where there has been a long history of a feminist movement and then people have become more gradually accepting of egalitarian new gender principles, but South Korea have relatively short history. We used to be a very patriarchal society, and then within generation we have changed a lot when it comes to women's labor force, participation and education. So this kind of changing gender hierarchy is creating a lot of frustration among young men, and that's considered to be one of the reasons that creates such a stark gender divide.
Like you said before, the gender divide, that phenomenon is not exclusive to South Korea, because New York Times last year reported that there is a gender divide in political opinion, saying that young people, especially men under 30, are more drawn to conservative ideas and support Trump. So what are the key reasons behind this?
Yes, as you mentioned, it's interesting to see that this kind of a gender divide and then young men's support for Donald Trump or, for example, the candidates and party who support the far-right ideology is happening not just in Korea and elsewhere. And one of the reasons, the easy answer is economic struggles, right? A lot of young people find it difficult to establish career. Even if they have a high education, it's difficult to purchase houses, and all these economic struggles is kind of pushing them to support the far-right ideology. However, that's not the entire story, because if you look at those who support far-right ideology, it's not just general young white men. Men who are doing financially okay are also supportive of Donald Trump. So it's not really about economic hardship. Another answer is that it's often status threat or fear of losing one's ground. So in most societies, as a man, you're born as a man, and then you're entitled to, have stable employment and then also access heterosexual relationship with women. But this kind of male entitlement is increasingly difficult to attain for most of the younger generation, which wasn't the case for older generations. So a lot of men feel fear that they're actually doing worse than their parents. So there are parents who didn't have enough education, were doing okay, and then their father was able to support their family, but now looking themselves, it's kind of becoming a middle class life is becoming a very distant dream for many of young people. So they're frustrated, and then their frustration is spill over into this political area. So one of the key predictor is perceived downward mobility. That's promoting young people to engage in this support. Because looking at Trump's slogan, it's "Make America Great Again." So it's perfectly crafted to feeling of this lost status and then desire to restore it. So that is why even if South Korea and the US and elsewhere have different economies and cultures and institutions, we are observing similar patterns among young people, and especially young men.
Yeah, related to that is an issue of reverse discrimination, because young men feel that they became the victim of the social change. Do you think this phenomenon is very unique to a certain country, or do you think it's a part of global trend? Male victimhood ideology was considered to be quite salient among Korean population. So Korean scholars started to document this male victimhood and anti-feminist sentiments a few years ago, but now it's seen as global phenomenon. Recent reports by Ipsos, nearly 61% of Gen Z men who was in their 20s at the time of 2024, and then they reported that feminism has gone too far, and now it limits boys and men's opportunities. And then there's other numerous studies that documents that male victimhood ideology is a dominant one, not even a small anti-feminist fraction. I recently also had a chance to collect data from the US, Spain, and South Korea. Normally, we would perceive that South Korea is one of the most conservative compared to Spain and the US when it comes to gender ideology, which is true. When you look at people's perception about women's role and men's role, women should stay at home and the men should go outside and work. And South Korea people tend to be quite conservative and traditional in that sense compared to Spain and the US. But when it comes to this male victimhood ideology, interestingly, Spain had the highest prevalence of male victimhood ideology compared to, followed by the US and South Korea. So interesting fact here is that actually male victimhood ideology is not prevalent in conservative or traditional societies, but could be more prevalent in society where feminism has been successful. So it is a backlash rather than political conservatism. The issue that we are concerned about is the possibility that gender conflict can become a political issue. So why do you think gender conflict has become politicized these days, and to the extent that certain age group becomes influencer in shaping the election outcome, for example?
Gender conflict is happening everywhere, but the connection between gender conflict and then the politicization of gender-based conflict is not happening everywhere. It's particularly salient in South Korea. And then also it happened in Spain as well. So the US, a lot of, like you mentioned, New York Times and the reporters are mentioning about this gender-based conflict, but that's not really at the center of public debate. So in the context of South Korea, why it became so politicized is because compared to other countries, there's no competing issues in South Korea politically. If you look at the US or Western country, there's an issue regarding especially immigration and then multiculturalism and ethnic diversity. But in Korea, even though we are becoming more ethnically diverse, arguably this kind of multiculturalism remain relatively absent, silent. So that's why gender becomes quite strong political driving force for this political polarization. And then, of course, some of the political leadership have recognized that this can be a good source of electoral gain. And it is true that there are many cases where politicians have exploited this social division in South Korea for their electoral gain, and which was also successful.
You already mentioned lots of ideas to improve the situation here in Korea. But do you have any last comments for policy consideration?
Policy considerations, apart from online interventions, another thing is I repetitively mention about this, the role of political leadership, that they should resist the temptation of exploiting these forces for electoral gains. And because it could be very useful for short-term elections, but it's going to create a long-lasting damage to our democratic institution. And another thing is, as a citizen, we also have to take some responsibilities, that we have to try to understand the structural sources of the problem, rather than fighting to each other. The problem comes from labor market and then unstable kind of economic precarity that is creating the frustration, right? So we have to try to engage in more constructive dialogue about how to solve this issue and how can we tackle these structural problems rather than scapegoating their problem to other people.
I do believe that the political leaders should address this issue and find right solutions to manage the challenges that we are going to have in the coming years. Well, I think that's all for today's discussion. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
Now it's time to examine key events shaping the world. Join me, Jina Kim, as we take a closer look at some of the major international issues capturing global attention. On January 15th, Israel and Hamas reached a 6-week ceasefire agreement in Gaza, initiating the first phase of a truce, which includes a hostage prisoner exchange. Subsequent phases are expected to address the release of remaining hostages, the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and discussions on the region's reconstruction. While Democrats frame Middle East peace mediation as part of President Biden's legacy, President Trump has also claimed significant credit for the negotiations. Though the ceasefire provides temporary relief, the long-term success of a broader peace framework and its consistent implementation remains uncertain. Cautious optimism is warranted. On January 12th, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai denounced the Taliban's increasing oppression of women, urging Muslim leaders to take a stand against such policies. She criticized the Taliban for banning women's education and justifying extreme gender discrimination, which she argued denies their fundamental human worth. By describing these policies as gender apartheid, Malala sought to elevate gender discrimination to the level of racial apartheid, which is recognized as a crime under international law. Her statement aims to highlight systemic oppression and push for concrete legal and political actions against the Taliban's human rights violations. Amid growing concerns over President Trump's hardline immigration policies, protests erupted on January 15th in Mexico, where migrants demonstrated against the National Institute of Migration. The demonstrations are partly linked to Trump's first-term immigration policies, particularly the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, which forced asylum seekers to remain in Mexican border cities while awaiting U.S. immigration proceedings. This policy has left an increasing number of migrants stranded in Mexico, exacerbating tensions and dissatisfaction with the INM's handling of the crisis. With Trump's return to office, Even stricter immigration policies are expected, raising concerns about the ripple effects these policies may have on Mexico's already strained migrant situation. Donald Trump has been inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States. With major shifts in global affairs expected over the next 4 years, South Korea is facing significant political turmoil and challenges. We hope this crisis serves as a stepping stone toward a stronger foundation for democracy. We'll be back next week with more updates. This has been Jina Kim.